Welcome to Celebrate the Gray. I'm Steve Wagner. This week I'm going to be talking about work and careers, and as an extension of that, I'll be talking about identity. For men, a lot of the time, work is an identity, if not our chief identity. I'm not excluding women in this, but really dealing in some age-old generalities. If a man goes into a social situation, meets another man, typically within the first couple of questions you'll be asked, what do you do for a living, or some variation of that. For women, a lot of times, the questions are different. When it comes to work, growing up, except for that brief time I wanted to be a professional baseball player, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I had the spirit of an entrepreneur. I remember seeing a need in my middle school cafeteria that I tried to fill. Isn't that the heart of an entrepreneur? To see a need, fill the need, enrich the lives of your customer, and in turn earn the profit to make a living. Well, our middle school only had cafeteria food, no vending machines full of candy, gum, or sodas. My bus stop was directly across from a gas station convenience store. And while sitting, waiting for the bus one cold morning, I was struck with an idea. Load up with gum and candy before school, and then sell the gum and candy for a profit at school. For that season, it worked great. My best seller, as I remember it, were Eye Poppers, a sour gumball that I could buy for a dime and sell at school for 25 cents. Packs of Bubblicious would sell for $1, 100% profit if I remember right. I would sell sodas also, but without a good way to keep them cold, people complained. I tried refrigerating them and then wrapping them in foil to keep them cold, but with no luck. Once I had the great idea that I could put the sodas in the freezer the night before instead of the fridge. This is when I learned that ice expands. Waking up to a freezer full of frozen soda, ruined product, and big loss on that day's profit. I still took some of the cans that only bulged and didn't explode to school to sell. Customers weren't having it. That was the last day in the soda business for me. I continued on with candy and gum until some competitors entered the market. And maybe I also subconsciously realized that middle schoolers from a low to middle class area were not a great target for a steady stream of extra money and income. Skip forward to college. My initial thought was that I was going to become an accountant, and no offense to the accountants, but the actual doing of accounting seemed extremely boring. So I switched toward athletic training, which was a compromise I had with my mom, who wanted me to be a physical therapist. After a semester of almost failing some science classes, and looking forward to the number of science classes I would have ahead of me, including a cadaver dissection, which is a guy who is having a hard time looking at the 4-inch incision I have in my forearm from a recent surgery, probably a little too squeamish to participate in a human dissection. I decided/remembered two things. I remembered that I was not a fan of science classes. Whoops. Second, I decided to switch back to a business major, but a more general management degree. And even better, there's a concentration in entrepreneurship. Finally, I was back on track. After college, I was hired on as the first business development manager for a franchise company called Signs by Tomorrow. My job was to provide consultation to franchisees around the country in operations management, marketing, sales. I traveled around the country helping to open new stores also. I got to see what made the good stores work and the bad stores fail. In total, I was at Signs by Tomorrow for almost 4 years, but something happened at the 2.5-year mark. There was a turning point that set me on the course that put me where I am right now. This is probably a good time to jump off for a quick aside. Last week on the podcast, I talked about a psychological phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect. For a more detailed look at that effect, give a listen to last week's episode. But a simple synopsis is that when someone has a little bit of knowledge in a subject, they tend to have an unproportional level of confidence. For example, the 16-year-old starring in the school play thinking they belong on Broadway, or the line cook at Chili's thinking they belong on Top Chef, or the baby-faced franchise consultant that thinks they can move their family to a new city, take over a closing store, and make it thrive. Now, confidence is not a bad thing, but blind overconfidence can have real consequences. With Signs by Tomorrow, as I mentioned, I traveled. About 40% of the year I was on the road. And when I traveled, it was typically for 2 weeks at a time. This was difficult as a newlywed, but manageable. But at 2.5 years, we added a baby to the mix with the birth of Zach. The stresses of traveling with a young wife and newborn reared its head almost immediately when I was on a trip 2 weeks after Zach was born. Our whole company was in New Orleans for an annual meeting. when we caught word of a blizzard heading towards the Baltimore area where I was living at the time. After a story that involved changing flights, closed airports, driving on closed highways, burying a rental car into a snowdrift as I gunned it into my condo parking lot, I stumbled across the condo threshold, not having slept in 36 hours, but home. The rest of the company were stuck and trailed behind me by 3 or 4 days. Even after a conversation with my boss about cutting back on travel after Zach was born, the company was booming and I ended up traveling more than ever. 50% of Zach's first year culminated in a 19-day trip to the Chicago area, where I 1, flew back in the middle for Zach to be baptized, and 2, spent my birthday in a sad riverboat casino with a near stranger that I was sent to Chicago to train. A combination of things happened that led to the next move. In the summer after Zach was born, we were close to buying a clothing store in the Kansas City area. We had no money, no assets, so actually buying it was not an option. But another franchisee was in talks to buy the store, hire me to run it, and I would buy it over time. Didn't work out, but laid a seed, and it stroked my ego. Then my performance slipped at work, culminating in a meeting with my boss and the company owner, which got pretty tense. My boss almost fired me on the spot, probably about the same time I almost quit on the spot. Our owner asked us to cool down, take the weekend to think about it, and we would talk on Monday. On Monday, I told them I was going to leave, and they graciously told me that I could stay until I found something else. Fast forward to April 17th, 2004. I got a call from the franchise salesman telling me that the store in Charlotte, North Carolina is closing for good April 30th, and they were offering a deal with owner financing, so I didn't need a loan, for someone to take it over. So on May 3rd, Julie and I were the owners of a Signs by Tomorrow store in Charlotte, North Carolina, armed with tons of confidence and what turned out to be not a lot of knowledge. Owning a business was always a struggle for us. Long hours, not enough money, lots of stress, but I was home every night and I had a feeling of accomplishment. It was my identity. We had ups and downs. At its peak, we employed 6 people, and at its lowest, you would find just me selling, designing, producing, installing. We were at a peak when the 2008-2009 recession hit, and the housing crisis loomed large. 60% of our business was gone seemingly overnight. I couldn't hold it together anymore, and we closed the store 2 months after our 4th child, Zadie, was born at the end of 2009. We had no jobs, 4 kids, and were in financial ruin. What happened from there is a story for another episode, but the ramifications financially reverberated really until last year. The ramifications mentally and relationally, well, I didn't have to worry about that overconfidence anymore. I landed on my feet after a bit with the company that I'm with now, Sign Art, who are a customer of mine at Signs by Tomorrow. I've worked my way into a sales position with decent security and good money. Work has become something that is comfortable, which has its benefits after the panic attack-inducing stress that I experienced in the 5 years of owning my own business. But in reflecting, as one often does when they hit their 40s, I realized that I have lost something along the way. I lost that middle school zeal for seeing a need and providing a solution. That feeling of meeting a new business owner at the point of most excitement and most stress, right before their endeavor launches, and knowing that something I built will help ease the stress, at least in the advertising of their big grand opening event. I think working with Julie, launching her podcast, launching this podcast, has given me a taste of that feeling I had back then. It takes time and it takes experience to do life well. I was a good gum and candy salesman, and I was a bad gum and candy salesman. I was a good consultant, and I was a bad consultant. I was a good business owner, and I was a bad business owner. I am a good husband, a good father, and I am a bad husband and a bad father. We are not our worst moments, and we are not our best moments. It's not that black and white. This week I interviewed a good friend of mine, Nick Vincent, on this topic of career and identity. He's recently gone through a pretty big change in his career and the place he is living. He picked up and moved his family from Charlotte up to Washington, D.C. to take a job with Amtrak. And I guess, sort of forgiven him at this point, so I decided I'd talk to him again, and I decided to share that conversation with you. That was a joke, by the way. I realized I delivered that kind of deadpan, and that may not come across right across the podcast. But Nick's a good friend of mine. We spent a lot of time running together and biking together. He has been along with me on this journey of changing the way I've been thinking, and he's been a good sounding board and a good ear to listen to me and also challenge some of the things that I've said. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation on career and identity. Towards the end of this, he gives a great synopsis of how he looks at work, and I think it's really, really inspiring. So please enjoy. So Nick, thanks for doing this. It's been a while since we've seen each other, but it's good to see your face again.
Yeah, I shaved for you. I'm looking pretty clean cut. Yeah.
That's good. I did not. My one arm is making grooming tough, hence the hat.
Sure.
Hoodie. So, we're talking about work, careers, and identity. Really, for men, it's identity is a big part of our careers are a big part of our identity. So I if you want to start just at that point in your life where you kind of figured out what you wanted to do, where you wanted to be.
I mean, we've talked about this before. I'm officially in my midlife crisis mode, so I'm not 100% sure I know what I want to do with the rest of my life yet. But we'll sort of talk about how I got to where I am to date. I think it probably started when I was in high school. So I went to a nerd school, the Central Virginia School of Science and Technology, in Lynchburg, Virginia. And I had the opportunity through that school to work for a company called Automated Industrial Technologies. I'm not sure if they're still around, but they gave me the opportunity to build a database for their scheduling and purchase order needs. And it was the terrible, I did an awful job, but they let me learn and grow. And, through the course of the summer, I actually built something somewhat reasonable and respectable. And I had never done anything like that before. I was one of those, the nerdiest piece of technology that I ever done is, I wired my 2-level house to play, peer games, my friends in the dungeon of our basement and I was upstairs and we play, nerdy games. But, I didn't really aspire to, develop or code or design. And so that kind of put the seed in my head to potentially think that, maybe I want to work in this, computer science space or technology space. And then, I got to college freshman year. Our RA was in our suite. The guy was from Texas, long hair, played guitar, had quite attractive friends over on occasion. And one day I asked him, I was like, hey, what's your major? And he's like, systems engineering. He's like, all my friends, they were getting these great jobs, signing bonuses, big deal. I was like, okay, so attractive girls, big dollars, and I'm 19 years old, and I'm like, that sounds like a great major. Leave it to a 19-year-old kid.
I can decide. Be a nerd, make money, and
leave it to a
and get married.
Decide the rest of his life. Right there in that moment, from some very, very shallow kind of features, but it ended up being a great decision. So I'll just chalk it up to dumb luck more than anything else. I ended up graduating with a systems engineering degree. But before I graduated, that last semester, I had to finish a undergraduate thesis and do all sorts of stuff. And I had an opportunity to go play some ultimate frisbee, spring break, girls, beach, the whole thing. And I was like, I really have to finish this thesis. And so this is where Nick grows up a little bit, right? Making wiser choices. And that spring break, I applied for a job. It was to work for Wachovia Bank. I knew Wachovia because I banked with them. I had my checking account. I think every college kid in the area probably had it with Wachovia or, some other, big major bank. But I applied spring break, and then a couple weeks later, they're like, hey, we'd like you to interview for the job. And I was like, you would? Okay. Well, I hadn't had any luck with interviews to date, so I was like, all right, sure, I'll interview you, whatever. It'll be good practice. Maybe I'll find some other technical role or whatever. And I just relax, had a good time. chatted them up. Like we joked, we laughed, and they're like, "Hey, we want to bring you in for an interview. We want you to come into Charlotte." I was like, "Charlotte? Where's Charlotte?" I probably couldn't even told you where it was on the map. Like I went and interviewed, and everyone in the room for the interview, they brought in a bunch of us, and everybody in the room like had a master's degree, had an MBA. Like they were the best of the best in terms of like the candidate pool. And I was like, well, it doesn't look like I'm getting a job. They had like 2 positions or 3 positions to open. I was like, whatever, I'm just going to have a good time. And so like, that's what I did. I just had a good time, like with the interview process, like hanging out with people, just chatting it up and like just having a good time. And they said, we loved you. We want to hire you. And I'm like, okay, so what am I going to do at a bank? And they're like, well, you're going to do analysis, you're going to write code, you're going to do database stuff. You're going to help us figure out why the bank has so much risk and how we can mitigate some of that risk. And I was like, okay, sounds good. Right. Like, so this 19-year-old kid who decided he wanted, to do it for the ladies and, make a big dollar, which, in retrospect, it was during a recession that I was hired. So those like big dollars that my RA had said were in 1999 at the height of the .com boom. And by the time I graduated, we're in a recession, in a major war and conflict, and those same payouts weren't happening to me then. And I was just happy to have a job. Actually, my dad, when they offered me the job, I told him I needed a night to think about it, and my dad was like, "You need what? Like they're the only ones offering your job, and it's going to pay the bills. Yeah. Are you a complete idiot?" And he's like, "You call them up right now and you tell them you want the job." I was like, "But Dad, that's not how you play. You got to play it cool." He's like, "No, you need them to give you a job." I was like, "Okay, Dad, sure."
Yes, you're not living in my basement anymore, is what he was saying.
He was like, "I see an opportunity for you to get off the payroll. You better go."
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So yes, that 19-year-old kid ended up making a smart decision. Yeah.
And so you went to Wachovia in Charlotte, which turned into Wells Fargo eventually.
That's right.
I still remember I remember the day that happened. I'm sure you do too, because you were there. But I was actually driving next to the big CIC building, and I heard it on the radio on a Monday morning. It was like, well, Wachovia is now Wells Fargo. As the story kind of rolled out, it was like they weren't going to open up on Monday if Wells Fargo didn't come in on Sunday or whenever it was and buy the bank. So that had to be a crazy time. And what did you do with them? Just kind of briefly. I know you had multiple roles during your time there.
Sure. Yeah. I think, that moment, like you bring it up, and like I just relived like a couple weeks of my life, like they just flashed right before my face. So I started with Wachovia, doing like more or less a management training program. They coached us up and taught us what we needed to know about credit risk management, which in retrospect, that was a little bit of a joke because Wachovia ultimately failed because of credit risk management policies. So, that's one strike in my career against me. I worked for Wachovia, which ended up, collapsing during the financial crisis. But not too long after I joined Wachovia, I decided I really wanted to work in the consulting space, do the traveling, do management consulting, and I did it for about a year. I was traveling all across the country, doing like more or less the typical thing that you would do for management and technology consulting, especially as a junior analyst. I did grunt work. They billed me out at a ridiculous amount, and they paid me a fraction of that ridiculous amount. And so, that when I learned the model of business really quick, that I was just a means to an end. And that was one of those life lessons that you have to learn the hard way, and you have to learn quick early on in your tenure. And I'm glad I had that, but it was not something that I necessarily wanted to do for the rest of my career. So, I left the consulting gig at, probably after a year, and went back to Wachovia. And it was a great time. It was a wonderful time to be involved with Wachovia. They launched some cool products in the deposit space, which I was in. I primarily worked in the analytics space, doing analytics on their deposit products. And that moment that you talked about, right? I remember it clearly. We would do daily reporting showing Wachovia's balance sheet and showing some of the financial runoff, and to actually see analytically a run on the bank was probably one of the craziest things I've ever seen. You would see $1 billion daily just go out of the bank's coffers as mostly commercial depositors were leaving the bank. It wasn't the mom and pops that were leaving. If that had happened, like let's say Washington Mutual, that Wells Fargo Wachovia marriage would have been a lot different. But because the consumer franchise was still great, like it was not as bad of a transition to go from Wachovia to Wells Fargo. So when I joined Wells Fargo, I had a manager at the time who was legacy Wachovia. He was like, "Hey, I'm going to a new job. I want you to come with me." I was like, "Oh, that sounds great." Like, cause I don't know if Wells Fargo is going to keep me around. And then the current Wells Fargo manager at the time was like, "Hey, we like you. Stay with us. And by the way, we'll pay you more." I was like, "All right, I like your answer." So like I stayed with Wells Fargo for, most of my career. So I probably had 16 or 17 years cumulative between Wachovia and Wells Fargo. And so, I have been in the I had been in the financial services for a very long time. And then I left financial services for, we'll probably go over, some of that background during your podcast, but I now work for Amtrak, still in the data space. I manage their data analytics team. It's a pretty decent sized shop, and we do all things data for Amtrak. Whether that's bringing in data from sensors, whether that's doing analysis on marketing, whether that's answering some financial questions. So it runs the gamut. So I still sort of hold to that sort of analytic type work, but I've sort of moved on to a different space for a lot of various reasons.
Yeah. We've talked before about one of those reasons, and I think a turning point seemed to be where kind of you decided to get out of financial services and banking was their deposit scandal back in 2016. You got wrapped up in that. You saw it happening before anybody kind of saw it happening from your side, the analytics
that's
side.
Right. So I'll give you kind of a little bit of a. I can't go into all the details, right? Because of litigation.
Or you have to call, or if you have to have a lawyer sitting there. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But a lot of it's in the public domain, so I feel like it's pretty comfortable. So I was the checking and savings analytic manager at the time of the Wells Fargo crisis. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with this, Wells Fargo was selling checking and savings accounts to customers where the customer either didn't know they got the product or service, or the banker sold the product and told them, it's okay, we're just going to do this real quick, and then I'll get the sales credit, you'll get to keep the account. If you want to use it later, that's cool. But it was really a scenario where the customers were getting products and services which they probably didn't want or necessarily need, and it's a bank's fiduciary responsibility to make sure they get them only the products and services they need without adding on and piling on other things that they don't. And so as an analytic manager, I had a pretty good sense of what was going on. I knew the scale of what it was going on. I shared it regularly. I had meetings and discussions with leaders within the organization, and said, "Hey, look, this is a problem." And fortunately, I had some decent leaders raise it up. But at the time, the bank was really run by the sales leadership, and whatever they wanted went. This is one of those moments where you look back and you're like, well, I think I did enough, right? Like, I think I did my part. But if I'm truly being honest with myself, I probably didn't. Like, I didn't do what I should have done to protect the customer. I shouldn't have done. I didn't do enough to protect those that needed protecting. And I hope through the course of our relationship, you probably know that that's not a place where I want to be, and that's not where I should be. And I knew I had a responsibility to help fix the problem. And I spent a lot of time with a lot of lawyers, and a lot of consultants and a lot of regulators, and more lawyers and more enforcement officers and more lawyers to help work towards getting it fixed, and making sure that the customers were taken care of, making sure that the controls were in place that it didn't happen again. But that level of work and that kind of stress and that sort of accountability it's tough. Like, you do a lot of soul searching. You look back and you think back and think, can I have done that? Could I have done that differently? Could I have helped protect people? Could I have raised that up? Could I have yelled a little louder? Would that have meant I would have lost my job? Would I have been blacklisted from the industry? It's definitely a soul searching kind of moment. It definitely puts a weight on you, and ultimately that was one of the core reasons that I ultimately left Wells Fargo. Is you can only wrestle with those kind of heavy topics for so long without needing to get away from it, because otherwise you see it every day, you hear it every day. Wells Fargo was in the news this week or 2 weeks ago for some of their refinance practices, and Wells Fargo is always going to have a target on its back as a potentially evil and devious company only out for profits. As an insider, for your audience, take it for what it's worth, right? But I honestly do believe there are a lot of very decent, honest, humble, and thoughtful people at Wells Fargo that want to do what's right for the customer. And that some of these things just happen because the bank is really large, and it's hard for any organization that big to micromanage every aspect of their business. But that doesn't sort of get them get out of jail free for that. But it does put it in perspective when you try to cast Wells Fargo in an evil light.
Yeah, and I think, lots of companies fall in that, large and small, where your employees are tied to a paycheck. It's not always the easiest thing in the world to do what, even when, I was going to say what's moral, but sometimes it's even murky about whether it's right or wrong, or I've never worked in a super large company like you. I've thought about it before, like, you manage a portion of Wells Fargo when you were there. And to someone like rungs and rungs up this chain, your entire operation that you're working on is like one cell in an Excel spreadsheet.
That's right.
And it's, so it is, I don't know. It's kind of hard to grasp that, but I think I think employees get put in tough situations in large companies and small companies. I think it can be actually hidden easier in a large company than it is in a small company.
Can I ask you a question?
How? Yeah.
Turn the tables a little bit. You ran your own business. Do you ever look back and think, man, I could have done that better? From sort of a moral standpoint, right? Like not necessarily like a dollars and cents standpoint, but there are some like choices in your running of a business. You're like, oh man, I wish I could have had that one back.
Absolutely. There were things and I will, as I kind of talk about my work experience during this podcast, I'm going to get into it a little bit, and it's going to be revealing, because it's a story that I don't necessarily tell very often. I ran a business and the recession hit, and it was tough and I couldn't keep it going. But it's kind of the story I tell. We just didn't make it. All of our customers were in real estate and some banking and things like that. And it was turmoil. I lost 60% of my business, but it's deeper than that. And it was messier than that. And it's, there's a lot that I would take back and change and do a little differently. And it's like a runaway train at some point, not to bring Amtrak into it, but it's just a boulder rolling down, boulder rolling down a hill. Yes. I hear you. I bet you hear lots of train puns at your new job.
Oh, no, it's great. Yeah. The internet site is All Aboard. right?
Nice.
And
Yeah.
anytime a project is having trouble, it's getting off the tracks, or it's
Yeah.
yeah, you definitely have to
It's
throw it.
derailed.
Yeah, yes, yeah. I've gone from a
So
stagecoach to now the train. So I figure my next career will be in like cars, modern transportation.
yeah,
I don't
you're stepping into the 20th century. Um,
know.
so I assume I'm going to make an assumption because this happened with me that before I lost my business, um, that defined me. People knew me as a business owner. I had a shop, and that's just where I was. I was a young business owner. And when that happened, it took there was searching that went on. Like, okay, what am I now? Like, but how did that change for you? Did you define yourself a certain way, and then kind of when you had a reckoning of where you were at, did that change, or has it been consistent for you?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I have had a little bit of a change. So I remember in my 20s, I would define myself as a UVA grad, right? Like that was something I was proud of. It was part of my identity. I love UVA sports, the whole thing. So I would identify myself as a UVA grad. I would identify myself as an ultimate frisbee player, right? Because I spent a lot of time. Like I would run summer leagues. I would compete both in like local scenes, but also national scenes, and it was a big part of who I was, right? And then I would define myself as a banker, right? Like I didn't know what being a banker was in my 20s, but it was who I was, right? So I was a frisbee playing banker that was also UVA grad, right? Like and then as I continued to grow, like the UVA thing no longer made a difference. Like I tore my ACL, so I wasn't playing as much ultimate. And I got married and I had kids, and so like slowly but surely my identity, like if somebody asks, in a private setting, asks who I was, I don't know if I would even say, I work for Wachovia. Maybe I would mention it in passing. Um, and then 2016 hit, and that moment was something that like I struggle with telling people that I work for Wells Fargo, right? Like I struggled that I said, "Hey, I work for Wells Fargo. Oh, and by the way, I work in the department where like all this crap happened, right? Like and where
Hmm.
it felt like I was it was definitely a low point in terms of like my relationship with work, because it was so taxing, so stressful, and then it actually made the national news, right? Like the old adage, like don't do anything that you wouldn't want to see in the New York Times the next day, as a kind of a decision point. Well, we did stuff that showed up in the New York Times the next day, and that's a tough place to be. It's something I struggle with, and so now when I define myself, um, I include the work, because I'm proud of what I do. Like it was a little bit of an evolution, right? Like I realized that my work and what I did and what I contributed to people's financial well-being is not something that I should diminish. Even though there was a scandal, the work that I was doing was still helping people manage their funds, helping them write checks, helping them use their debit card. So I felt like I still had a positive contribution to society at large, right? Albeit a cell in somebody's spreadsheet, but I still felt like I had something to give. So like it took it. There was definitely the stages of grief that went on like post 2016 for me. But like once I got through that, like I was okay with like identifying as and a Wells Fargo employee as opposed to not even mention it. Now working for Amtrak, I don't have the problem with the but still we make the news, right? Like if we do something dumb, people can get hurt, and so it just you realize you have to do your best for yourself, for your family, represent your community, and do what's best for your customers. And if you do that, like you can go to sleep at night and rest easy. But I realized in sort of my identity sort of struggle and journey that there's always going to be one of those moments where your identity needs to shift because something's been taken away from you or been added to you, and you should continue to evolve who you are. Otherwise, like you're not going to have anything left at the end if you're not willing to add or change or make a different statement about yourself.
That leads into kind of the last question. I have one more after this, but and you hit on it a little bit, but I think that when we talk about what we do for a living, and really the crux of kind of where I'm going with this week's podcast is for guys, when you go out to a function and you meet another couple, you meet the guy and one of the first questions you're going to get is, what do you do for a living?
Yeah.
And it's just where it is, and then you tell them and I know I do. I tend to say things that make it maybe more grandiose than I really think it is. So I think the question, whether I can word it right, is what's the difference with how you talk about what you do to someone and its importance versus what you say to yourself about what you do and its importance. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. So my official title at Amtrak is Senior Director of Insights and Analytics. And I report to the Chief Technology Officer of Amtrak. And when I first started work, I thought, man, that would be a similar title to what I expected in my 20s, right? Like that would have been it. I would have said I made it. And professionally, like I feel pretty good about that. And then so if like people ask, hey, what do you do? Like I guess I would say that title and I would tell them what my team does and what the role is. But like that doesn't feel like me. That's not, that title is as far from me as possible. If I really think about who I am and what I do, it's the idea that I am someone who is empathetic. I support the people that I work with. I share life with them. Right. I support them when they struggle. I teach and coach and I train people who might not know the subtleties of work. I provide strategic guidance on like life choices. I'll talk to people about buying houses or thinking about their investment portfolio. And the work that I do at Amtrak is just, a sliver of what I really do for Amtrak, right? Like it's so like, I might have like a technically cool title, but like that's not how I think or want to be thought of in the work that I do. I want people to think about what I do for them and how I uplift them and how I share and grow with them. And really the idea that I'm just someone who tells people what to do as a manager, that's as far from me. And if you talk to employees, like that wouldn't, they wouldn't think of me like that. I at least I hope not. Maybe you can find some old disgruntled ones, but I don't think that's the case. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm interviewing them next.
It's like a 360, like one of those corporate 360s. Hey, what do you think of Nick?
Yeah, this was just a big gotcha. So I stepped right into my web.
I'm going to tell you another side story because it happened this week. I had a tough moment at work, really tough. I fired an intern. Now, you've had interns before and like you guys have interacted with interns, but the kid just didn't show up. And he was a sweet kid, but like he just didn't come to work or didn't come prepared or didn't do anything. And so like I had, normally I could have just been hey, I'm going to fire you, right? Like, and that would have been the end of the conversation. I'd take away his access. But I spent an hour with that kid in terms of life coaching, thinking about what he could have done better, talking about his career prospects, giving him career advice, working on his resume. Like, I feel like I feel like that if there was anything that was a truly representative of like how I approach work, it was that moment. Like, it's an incredibly low moment for both me. Like, like it hurts me. Like, it hurts me to fire somebody. Like, I don't want to see that happen, because I feel like I failed them, right? But also, that I would still use it as an opportunity to uplift someone, even if you can, like firing a college kid. But that was something that at least the last week that I struggle with, but also I hope it like positions him for a little bit of a turnaround.
Yeah. Well, knowing you, I'm sure that it got to a point where he kind of fired himself.
He
Sure, you gave
apologized.
him
He
opportunities.
apologized to me. Like, he apologized to me
Yeah.
for firing him. He's like, I'm sorry, I let you down.
But it's, I've heard, well, I guess I heard it from a pastor we both know, that people think that they have to be in ministry to make a difference in that way, but it really, whatever you're doing, you really have the opportunity to be a neighbor, to be a friend, to have a ministry, towards the people that are around you. So it sounds like that's the approach that you're taking.
Yeah, I think so. And we've talked about, you and I have had this dialogue and discussion many a times, but the idea that you can be a Christian banker and that can be your ministry, right? But you have to live it, and you have to live it all the time, and you have to hold yourself accountable to living in that space. Now, you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to fail, and you're going to fall. But if there's any truth, and I think that's what you're trying to get to the bottom of, that if you're going to be true to anything you believe, that you have to live it every single day, and it has to show up. And work is just one medium for that to show up.
Yeah. And that's always not easy. Now, the last question that I'm going to kind of flip around and let you do it. What didn't I ask you that you think would be worthy to share, knowing where I'm kind of going with this? And if there's nothing, that's fine. We can.
No, yeah. Let's think about that. So truth at work, right? Because this is what it is. It's us growing in our gray, right? And finding identity and truth. Well, maybe let me flip the question on you. And I know you're going to share some more in your podcast, but like how do you identify yourself now? Like, if somebody comes up to you at a cocktail party, non-alcoholic, of course, somebody comes to you at a party and asks you, "Hi, I'm Nick," and you say, "I'm Steve," and I'm like, "So, Steve, what do you do when you're not at a cocktail party? How would you answer that question?"
I think it's still work, but I have a different relationship with work than I used to. But then, it tends to be, for me, to be work. I have a lot of kids. And that's really, kind of what I do. Up until a couple weekends ago, I would have said I was
you were
a flag football
a weekend
player,
warrior, not a weekend warrior anymore.
A weekend warrior. I took care of that. But I'm a sign salesman. I mean, that's really the crux of it. I have a friend that Dave Throckmorton, who is a VP at Aldi. That I've always liked what people ask him. When people ask him what he does, he's like, "I work at a grocery store," But he's in charge of 100 Aldis around the area. Sure. But I work at a grocery store.
Yeah,
I'm in the grocery business. So, and that's kind of, I kind of chased some grandeur when it came to work, and I've not chasing it so much anymore. I think it's given me a better balance.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered your question, but it's still, I think it's still work. Well, cool. I really appreciate you hopping on tonight.
Hopefully I can come back to the CLT and say hi.
Yeah. One more thing. If you haven't heard of this literary method, let me introduce it to you. It is the idea of an unreliable narrator. This is the idea of someone telling a story as truth, only to find out that the narrator was not being completely truthful or was lying outright. Good examples of this would be the movies The Usual Suspects or Fight Club. Books like Catcher in the Rye and Huckleberry Finn are examples in literature. Now, nothing I said earlier was a lie, but I did leave some things out. The money for my candy and gum sometimes came from my parents, without their knowledge. I spoke of closing the business like it was my choice. Truth was, the franchise, the landlord, and the state of North Carolina all decided the date on that closing. The time when I was working alone in the store, I was working without heat or hot water because I could not afford the gas bill. In the time between closing the store and last year, my house was in foreclosure 3 times, though we never lost it, and I had a car repoed in the middle of the night. Why do I bring this up, and how does it fit in this podcast series? Well, it's really 2 reasons. It's not for pity. People everywhere are going through similar or worse things than we did. The first reason is that very few people know the things that I just told you. What I said will come as a surprise to people very close to me. Everyone has stories like that. There is more to people than what they show the public. People are not the sum of their worst moments or traits. Second, you have to understand that the person telling a story has control of the information flow. One of the lessons I have learned and have continued learning every day is that we are ultimately responsible for the beliefs that we hold. There is information coming at us from so many directions, from so many sources, and it is important for us to know and understand who the narrator is and what they're trying to accomplish. Thank you for listening to Celebrate the Gray. I really appreciate you being here. If you wouldn't mind, if you like this podcast, please leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. And don't hesitate to tell a friend. Have a great rest of your day.